They burned her ranch and killed her husband, but the widow came back for vengeance. The ranch stood alone under a wide sky that seemed to stretch forever. It was not the biggest ranch in the valley, but it was known for its honesty and hard work. Every fence post had been set by steady hands. Every board of the barn carried a story, and every trail across the land showed years of quiet dedication. The woman who lived there had always believed that a peaceful life came from simple routines. She woke early each morning, stepped outside to breathe the cold air, and watched the sun slowly touch the hills. Decider was her husband, a man respected by neighbors and strangers alike, not because he was loud or powerful, but because he kept his word. They had built their life together slowly. Nothing had come easily, and that was why the ranch meant so much to them. Long days were spent repairing fences, tending animals, and making plans for the future. Evenings were quieter, shared meals, soft conversations, and the kind of silence that comes from deep understanding rather than emptiness. The town nearby knew them as reliable people. If someone needed help, the rancher would show up without being asked twice. If someone passed by their land, they were offered water or a place to rest. For years, the world felt stable. Then, strangers began appearing. At first, it seemed harmless. Riders passed by more often than usual. Some stopped to ask about buying land. Others watched from a distance before moving on. The husband noticed the change immediately. He became quieter, more thoughtful, studying tracks near the fence line and looking toward the horizon longer than before. The woman sensed his worry, but trusted his judgment. When she asked what troubled him, he said only that times were changing and not everyone who smiled meant well. One afternoon, a well-dressed man arrived at the ranch. He did not look like a rancher or a traveler. His clothes were too clean, his boots too polished for dusty roads. He spoke politely but directly. He offered to buy the land, saying that the valley would soon become valuable. The husband refused without hesitation. The ranch was not for sale. It was their home, built with years of effort and memories that could not be priced. The visitor smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. He left without arguing, yet the air felt heavier after he rode away. Days passed, and tension grew quietly. Tools were moved from where they had been left. Footprints appeared near the barn at night. Once the woman found a gate open that she knew she had closed. Her husband said little, but he began keeping his rifle closer and checking the property more often. Still, they continued their routines, hoping that whoever was watching would lose interest. The evening before the fire felt strangely calm. The sky turned soft shades of orange and gold, and the wind carried the scent of dry grass. They sat outside together, sharing a simple meal. For a moment, everything felt normal again. They spoke about repairing a section of fence, and about a young horse that had finally begun to trust them. She laughed at something he said, and he smiled in that quiet way that had always made her feel safe. Neither of them knew it would be their last peaceful night together. Darkness settled slowly, bringing a silence that felt heavier than usual. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The woman went inside while her husband stayed outside to finish a small task. Minutes later, she heard the sound of hooves, more than one rider approaching fast. Her heart began to race. Before she could step outside, shouting broke through the night. The fire started suddenly. Flames climbed the barn like a living thing, moving too quickly to be an accident. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. She ran toward the door, calling for her husband. Outside, shadows moved through the firelight. Men on horseback, faces hidden, voices cold and confident. Fear hit her like a wave, but she pushed forward, searching for him through the chaos. Gunshots echoed, sharp and terrifying. She dropped to the ground, covering her head, unsure where danger came from. The heat grew unbearable as sparks fell around her. She saw her husband trying to reach the animals, trying to save what he could despite the danger. He shouted for her to stay back, his voice urgent yet calm. She wanted to run to him, but another explosion of sound forced her to freeze. Time felt slow and broken. The attackers did not stay long. Their purpose seemed clear. Destruction, not theft. They circled once more, watching the fire spread, and then disappeared into the darkness as quickly as they had come. The woman crawled toward her husband, coughing through smoke and tears. The flames roared louder, consuming everything they had built together. When she reached him, the world changed forever. The realization came quietly at first, like a whisper she refused to understand. She held his hand, calling his name again and again, hoping for movement, for a breath, for anything that meant he was still with her. But the silence that followed was deeper than any silence she had ever known. Neighbors arrived too late to save the ranch. By dawn, only blackened wood and ash remained. The barn had collapsed, fences lay broken, and smoke still curled into the morning sky. People spoke softly around her, offering comfort she barely heard. Some suggested she leave the valley. Others said starting over somewhere else would be easier. She did not answer. Instead, she stood in the ruins, staring at the land that had once been full of life. Her face was calm, but inside her, grief moved like a storm. Memories flashed in her mind. Laughter at sunset, long days of work, the promises they had made to each other. For a moment she felt empty, as if everything had been taken from her. Then something changed. She bent down and picked up a small piece of burned wood. It was warm, fragile, easily broken. She held it carefully, studying it as if it held answers. The wind brushed against her face, carrying away the last of the smoke. Slowly she lifted her eyes toward the horizon. She understood that leaving would be easier. No one would blame her if she walked away from the pain. But as she looked across the land, she felt a quiet strength rising. This place was more than a memory. It was proof of the life they had built together. And she was not ready to abandon it. The town expected her to sell what remained and disappear. They saw her as a widow, alone against forces too strong to fight. But beneath her calm exterior, a new determination began to form. She would learn what happened. She would understand why the ranch had been targeted, and she would not allow fear to decide her future. The sun rose higher, lighting the ashes with a golden glow. People began to leave, returning to their own lives, but she stayed where she was. She took a deep breath, letting the pain settle into something quieter, something sharper. Her story was not ending here. This was only the beginning. The days after the fire felt slow and heavy, as if time itself had lost direction. The ranch no longer looked like a home. Ash covered the ground, and the smell of smoke stayed in the air long after the flames were gone. The widow walked through the ruins every morning, not because she wanted to remember the pain, but because she refused to turn away from what had happened. Each broken board and burned fence reminded her of what she had lost, yet it also reminded her of what still remained. People from town visited during the first week. Some brought food, others offered quiet words meant to comfort her. They spoke softly, avoiding direct questions about the night of the fire. Fear lingered behind their kindness. Everyone knew who might be responsible, but no one wanted to say it aloud. Trouble in the valley had a way of silencing voices. Many expected her to leave. They assumed she would sell what remained of the land and move somewhere safer. When they hinted at this, she simply listened without answering. She had not yet decided what her future would look like, but she knew one thing clearly. She would not run away without understanding the truth. Living alone changed everything. Tasks that once felt simple now required strength and patience. She learned to repair tools with hands that had mostly done lighter work before. She struggled at first, making mistakes and starting again. Every small success gave her confidence. Each nail hammered into place felt like a promise to herself that she could survive. Nights were the hardest. Silence filled the small temporary shelter she built near the edge of the property. She often woke to the sound of wind moving through burned wood, mistaking it for footsteps. Memories came without warning. Her husband's laughter, his quiet advice, the way he used to study the sky before storms. Sometimes grief felt too heavy to carry, but she refused to let it break her. Instead, she turned pain into purpose. She began paying closer attention to details around her. Tracks near the property caught her eye. She noticed patterns in the way strangers passed through the valley. She visited town more often, listening carefully to conversations in the general store or outside the blacksmith's shop. She did not ask direct questions, she simply observed. One afternoon she stopped by the sheriff's office. The building felt smaller than she remembered. The sheriff greeted her politely but avoided meeting her eyes for too long. He spoke about ongoing investigations, about needing time, about the difficulty of finding proof. His words sounded practiced, as if he had repeated them many times. She sensed hesitation beneath his calm voice. Leaving the office, she realized she could not rely entirely on others to seek justice. That understanding did not make her angry. Instead, it made her more focused. She returned to the ranch and started rebuilding small parts of her life. First came a simple fence around the area where animals once grazed. Then she repaired a storage shed that had survived the fire. Each day she set small goals. Work kept her mind steady and gave shape to her determination. The townspeople began noticing her change. She no longer moved like someone lost in grief. Her steps became steady and purposeful. She spoke less but listened more. Even those who doubted her at first started to respect her quiet strength. One evening, an older rancher stopped by. He had known her husband for years and carried deep sadness in his eyes. He told her that land buyers had been visiting several properties recently, offering large sums of money. Some ranchers sold out of fear or temptation, while others resisted. Those who refused sometimes faced threats. The widow listened carefully, understanding that her tragedy might be part of something larger. The idea shifted her thinking. Perhaps the fire had not been only about her or her husband. Maybe it was part of a bigger plan. From that day forward, she began gathering information with patience. She visited nearby towns under simple excuses, talking to people who had seen suspicious riders or heard strange rumors. She kept mental notes of names, places, and dates. Instead of rushing toward revenge, she chose careful observation. Learning new skills became part of her daily routine. She practiced riding longer distances, improving her endurance. She learned to handle tools and equipment she had once left to her husband. She studied maps of the region, marking locations where land disputes had occurred. Each small piece of knowledge felt like another step toward understanding the truth. Some nights doubt crept in. She wondered if she was chasing shadows, if the effort would lead nowhere. During those moments, she stood outside and looked at the stars, remembering how her husband used to speak about patience. He believed that strong foundations were built slowly. Holding on to that memory gave her strength. As weeks turned into months, the valley began to see her differently. She was no longer viewed as a grieving widow waiting for rescue. She became someone who moved with quiet purpose, someone who refused to be defined by tragedy. One afternoon, while visiting the market, she overheard two men talking about land deals connected to powerful investors from outside the region. They mentioned pressure being placed on ranch owners who resisted selling. Though the conversation ended quickly when they noticed her listening, it confirmed her growing suspicion. She returned home with renewed focus. If the fire had been part of a larger plan, then uncovering that plan required patience and intelligence, not reckless action. Gradually, she began forming small connections with others who had experienced similar pressure. A farmer who lost access to water rights, a family who sold their land after receiving threats. These stories revealed patterns. Though people spoke quietly, they trusted her because they saw her determination. Through these conversations, she learned the name of a man believed to be organizing many of the deals. He rarely appeared in person but sent representatives to negotiate. His reputation carried weight, and many feared opposing him. The knowledge filled her with a mix of anger and clarity. She realized that seeking justice was not only about her husband anymore. Others had suffered as well. Understanding this gave her purpose beyond personal grief. Back at the ranch, she continued rebuilding slowly. Each repaired structure symbolized progress. She planted new grass where the fire had destroyed everything. Watching green shoots emerge from dark soil reminded her that recovery was possible. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, she paused to rest. The land looked different now, scarred, but alive. She felt a quiet sense of strength growing within her. She was no longer the person she had been before the fire. Loss had changed her, but it had also awakened something deeper. She realized that survival alone was not enough. She wanted answers. She wanted truth. And she was willing to work for it. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with risks and challenges. Yet for the first time since the fire, she felt a clear direction guiding her forward. She would continue learning, continue watching, and continue preparing until the moment came when she could face those responsible. The wind moved gently across the land, carrying away the last traces of smoke from the past. She stood quietly, feeling both the weight of memory and the strength of determination. Her journey had only just begun. The seasons began to change, and with them the widow changed as well. The woman who once moved carefully through life now walked with quiet purpose. Every morning started before sunrise. She checked the rebuilt fence line, fed the few animals she had managed to save or replace, and studied the land like someone learning it for the first time. Her work was no longer only about survival. It had become preparation. She kept thinking about the stories she had heard. Landowners pressured to sell, strangers offering large sums of money, families leaving the valley without clear explanation. The pieces of the puzzle did not yet form a full picture, but she knew they were connected. Her husband had refused to sell, and shortly after, everything they built had been destroyed. The timing was too exact to ignore. Instead of rushing toward answers, she chose patience. She began traveling farther from the ranch, sometimes under the excuse of trading supplies, sometimes simply to observe. She rode along old trails, stopping in small towns where people rarely asked many questions. In each place she listened more than she spoke. Conversations in general stores, cafes, and stables revealed small clues. Names repeated, locations matched. Rumors hinted at a larger operation quietly buying land across the region. One afternoon she met a man who had once worked as a surveyor. He spoke about new maps being drawn, about hidden interests that wanted control of the valley. Though he avoided giving direct details, his nervous tone confirmed her suspicions. Something powerful was moving behind the scenes. As she gathered information, she became more aware of the risks. She noticed unfamiliar riders watching from a distance. Sometimes she felt eyes on her when she entered town. At first the feeling unsettled her, but she refused to show fear. Instead, she adjusted her routine, becoming more careful about when and where she traveled. Her strength grew not only from determination but from discipline. She trained herself to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly even when emotions rose. The memory of her husband guided her. He had always believed that steady actions mattered more than sudden reactions. One evening she returned to the ranch after a long journey and found fresh tracks near the property line. They were recent, made by someone riding slowly, as if studying the land. She followed the tracks briefly before stopping. Chasing blindly would lead to mistakes. Instead, she memorized the pattern and returned home, knowing that whoever watched her might be waiting for her to act without thinking. The next day, she visited a neighboring rancher who had lost part of his land under unclear circumstances. He welcomed her warmly, recognizing the pain she carried. Over tea, he spoke about how representatives pressured him to sell, offering money that seemed too generous at first but came with hidden threats when he refused. His voice carried quiet anger but also fear. She realized she was not alone. Gradually, she began building connections with others who had similar experiences. These were not dramatic alliances formed overnight, but slow bonds built on shared understanding. A farmer who noticed strange activity near his fields. A widow who sold her land after receiving warning letters. A young ranch hand who overheard conversations between traveling agents. Each person added another piece to the story. With time, her investigation turned into something larger than personal revenge. She began to see herself as part of a group seeking truth and fairness. This understanding changed her perspective. She was no longer only fighting for her husband's memory but for the future of the entire valley. Despite her growing confidence, moments of doubt remained. Sometimes she wondered if she had the strength to continue. During those times, she returned to the ruins of the old barn and sat quietly, remembering who she used to be. Instead of feeling weakness, she felt gratitude for the journey that had shaped her into someone stronger. Her travels eventually led her to a small town known for its busy trading routes. There she heard the name of a businessman believed to control many of the land deals. He rarely appeared publicly, choosing to work through representatives who handled negotiations and avoided attention. The description matched the well-dressed man who had once visited her ranch. The realization sent a chill through her, but it also gave her clarity. She finally had a direction. Instead of confronting anyone directly, she focused on collecting proof. She recorded details in a small notebook: dates, conversations, and observations. She studied patterns, noticing how landowners who resisted often faced sudden difficulties. The pattern revealed strategy rather than coincidence. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, rebuilding continued slowly. She planted new crops and repaired more structures, not only to restore the land but also to show that she was not afraid. Her resilience became a quiet message to those watching. She would not disappear. As her confidence grew, so did her understanding of people. She learned how to recognize when someone spoke honestly and when someone hid the truth behind polite words. These skills allowed her to navigate conversations carefully, gaining information without revealing her intentions. One evening, she attended a local gathering where ranchers discussed the future of the valley. Many expressed concern about rising pressure to sell their land. Some argued that change was inevitable, while others believed unity could protect them. She listened quietly, realizing that fear divided people and made them easier to control. After the meeting, a woman approached her privately. She had lost her family ranch years earlier, under similar circumstances. She warned the widow that powerful interests rarely backed down easily. The advice was not meant to discourage, but to prepare her for the challenges ahead. Returning home that night, the widow felt a mix of determination and caution. She understood that the path she had chosen would not be simple. Yet for the first time since the fire, she felt close to uncovering the truth behind the attack. Standing outside under the stars, she reflected on how far she had come. Grief still lived inside her, but it no longer controlled her actions. Instead, it fueled a steady drive toward justice. She realized that the next step would bring her closer to those responsible. The thought did not fill her with fear, but with calm readiness. The hunt for truth had begun quietly, and now it was leading her toward a confrontation she knew could change everything. The road back to her hometown felt different from the first time she had left it. Months earlier, she rode away as someone searching for answers. Now she returned with knowledge, patience, and a quiet strength that showed in the way she carried herself. The landscape looked familiar: wide fields, dusty trails, and the distant hills that once felt like home. But she was no longer the same woman who had watched her life burn under a dark sky. As she approached the valley, memories came back slowly. Every turn in the road held echoes of the past. She remembered riding beside her husband, laughing at small things, planning a future that had once felt certain. The memories hurt, but they no longer weakened her. Instead, they reminded her why she had come back. The ranch stood where she had left it, partly rebuilt, partly scarred. Fresh grass had started growing over burned ground, soft green against blackened wood. The sight filled her with quiet pride. She had rebuilt more than structures. She had rebuilt herself. People in town noticed her almost immediately. News of her travels had already spread, carried by traders and travelers who spoke about the determined widow gathering stories across the region. Some greeted her warmly, curious about what she had learned. Others watched from a distance, unsure of what her return might mean. She began by reconnecting with those who had supported her before. The older rancher who first warned her about land buyers welcomed her with relief. He listened carefully as she shared pieces of what she had discovered. Not everything, only enough to show that the problem extended far beyond their town. He nodded slowly, confirming that pressure on local ranchers had increased during her absence. The widow realized that timing mattered. She could not act too quickly or reveal too much before she was ready. Instead, she moved carefully, strengthening relationships and observing changes around her. One afternoon, she visited the general store. Conversations quieted slightly when she entered, then slowly returned to normal. She noticed two unfamiliar men near the back, dressed neatly, speaking in low voices. "Bear's shadow," Their presence reminded her of the well-dressed visitor who had once tried to buy her land. Though she did not approach them directly, she listened closely, catching fragments of conversation about contracts and negotiations. The tension in town had grown. Some ranchers looked worried, while others seemed eager to accept offers that promised financial security. The division made it easier for outsiders to gain influence. She understood that fear often pushed people to make decisions they would later regret. Instead of confronting anyone publicly, she focused on gathering support quietly. She met with small groups of ranchers, sharing stories she had heard from other regions. She spoke calmly, encouraging them to ask questions before signing anything. Her goal was not to create conflict, but to help people see the larger pattern. Gradually, trust formed around her. Meanwhile, she continued investigating the man believed to be behind the land deals. She learned that he planned to visit the area soon to finalize agreements. The thought filled her with both anticipation and caution. Months of preparation had led to this moment. One evening, she rode along the edge of her property and noticed movement near the old barn site. A rider stood watching the land, then turned away when he saw her approaching. The brief encounter confirmed her suspicion that she was being monitored. Instead of reacting emotionally, she returned home and made careful notes, adding the detail to everything she had learned. Her strategy was simple but powerful: gather truth, build alliances, and wait for the right moment. Days later, a meeting was announced in town. A representative of the land investment group would present plans for development and offer new contracts. Many ranchers planned to attend, curious or hopeful about the promises being made. The widow decided to go, understanding that this gathering could reveal more than private conversations ever could. The meeting took place in a large hall filled with wooden chairs and restless voices. The representative spoke confidently about progress, opportunity, and economic growth. He described the valley's future as something inevitable, something that required cooperation from everyone. Some people listened with interest, others remained silent. The widow sat quietly near the back, observing reactions. She noticed how carefully the speaker avoided certain questions. When someone asked about families who had lost land under pressure, the representative gave vague answers. When another person mentioned the fire that destroyed her ranch, the room grew silent for a moment before the conversation shifted quickly. She understood then that truth alone would not change anything. It needed to be presented clearly and at the right time. After the meeting, she spoke privately with several ranchers who felt uneasy about the offers. She encouraged them to wait before making decisions, reminding them that unity gave them strength. Her calm confidence began influencing others. Slowly, more people started questioning the situation instead of accepting it without thought. The following days brought increased tension. Riders passed near her property more often. Some townspeople warned her to be careful, sensing that powerful interests disliked resistance. Though she felt the weight of danger, she refused to let fear control her actions. One evening, she received unexpected information from a trusted ally. Documents suggesting illegal pressure tactics used to force land sales. The discovery changed everything. For the first time, she held evidence strong enough to challenge those responsible. She spent hours reviewing the papers, making copies, and planning her next steps. The decision ahead required courage and precision. Acting too soon could put others at risk. Waiting too long could allow the situation to worsen. Standing outside under the fading light, she thought about her husband. He had believed in fairness and honesty, even when facing powerful opponents. She felt his presence in her memory, guiding her toward a path that balanced strength with wisdom. The valley felt tense, as if everyone sensed something approaching. Conversations grew quieter, and rumors spread quickly. Some people avoided her, afraid of being connected to trouble. Others offered silent support through small gestures, a nod, a handshake, a shared look of understanding. She knew that confrontation was near. Returning to the ruins of the old barn one evening, she stood where the fire had started months earlier. The air felt calm, carrying only the sound of wind through grass. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to remember the life she had lost. When she opened them again, her gaze held determination rather than sorrow. The time for preparation was ending. Soon, She would face those responsible not with anger alone, but with truth strong enough to change everything. The morning of the final confrontation arrived quietly. The sky was pale, and the air carried a calm stillness that felt almost unreal after everything she had endured. The widow woke before sunrise, as she had done every day since the fire. She stepped outside and looked across the land that had changed her life forever. The rebuilt fences stood strong. Fresh grass-covered areas that once held only ashes. The ranch was not fully restored, but it was alive again. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Months of preparation had led to this moment. She had gathered evidence, spoken with people who trusted her, and built connections strong enough to challenge those responsible for the destruction. Today, she would bring everything into the open. Word had spread that another meeting would take place in town. Representatives of the land investment group planned to finalize agreements with several ranchers. Many expected the meeting to be simple, a formality before contracts were signed, but she knew it would become something far more important. She rode into town slowly, her posture calm and confident. People watched her as she passed. Some offered quiet nods of support. Others looked uncertain, unsure what would happen next. The tension in the air was clear. Even those unaware of her plans sensed that something significant was about to unfold. The meeting hall filled quickly. Ranchers, farmers, townspeople, and curious visitors gathered, their conversations low and careful. At the front stood the well-dressed representatives, speaking with confidence as they prepared documents on a long wooden table. Among them was the man she had searched for, the one believed to be directing the land deals from behind the scenes. He appeared calm, certain of his control over the situation. She entered without rushing, taking a seat near the center of the room. The presentation began with familiar promises. The representatives spoke about progress, opportunity, and a future that required change. They described how selling land would bring growth and security. Some people listened with interest, but many looked uneasy. The widow watched carefully, waiting for the right moment. When the floor opened for questions, silence filled the room. No one wanted to speak first. Finally, she stood. Her voice remained steady as she began. She spoke not with anger, but with clarity. She described the pattern she had discovered. Landowners pressured to sell, threats hidden behind polite words, and tragedies that followed refusal. She mentioned her own ranch without dramatic detail, focusing instead on facts. Murmurs spread through the crowd as people recognized similarities to their own experiences. The representatives tried to interrupt, but she continued calmly. She presented documents showing connections between different land deals. She explained how contracts were structured to force people into difficult choices. With each piece of information, the room grew quieter. The turning point came when others began speaking. One rancher stood and confirmed her story. Another shared how his family had felt pressured to sell. A woman described losing her property after refusing an offer. Their voices strengthened her words, turning individual stories into undeniable truth. The well-dressed man at the front attempted to regain control, dismissing the claims as misunderstandings. But doubt had already spread. The sheriff, who had remained silent for months, stepped forward after reviewing the documents she provided. He announced that further investigation would be necessary before any agreements could continue. The atmosphere shifted completely. People who had once felt powerless now spoke openly. Questions filled the room. The representatives lost their confident tone, struggling to respond clearly. The widow remained calm, allowing the truth to speak for itself rather than pushing for revenge. The confrontation did not end with dramatic action. Instead, it unfolded through conversation, exposure, and collective courage. By the time the meeting ended, no contracts were signed. The future of the valley remained uncertain, but for the first time, the balance of power had changed. Outside the hall, townspeople gathered around her. Some thanked her quietly, others simply shook her hand, unable to find words strong enough to express their gratitude. She accepted their kindness with humility, reminding them that the truth belonged to everyone who had spoken up. Days later, official investigations began. Though the process moved slowly, The pressure placed on landowners stopped almost immediately. The representatives left town, their influence weakened by public scrutiny. The well-dressed man who had once appeared untouchable lost his control over the situation as authorities examined his actions more closely. For the widow, the outcome brought a sense of closure rather than victory. She had not sought destruction or revenge driven by anger. She had wanted truth, and now it stood in the open. Life gradually returned to a calmer rhythm. She focused again on rebuilding the ranch, this time with renewed hope. Neighbors offered help inspired by her courage. Together they repaired structures, planted new crops, and restored the land piece by piece. The ranch became a symbol not only of survival but of unity. One evening she stood near the spot where the old barn once stood. The new structure rose slowly behind her, built stronger than before. The sunset painted the sky with warm colors, reminding her of peaceful evenings long ago. She felt sadness for what she had lost, but the sadness no longer felt overwhelming. It existed alongside pride and quiet strength. People in the valley began telling her story. Some called her brave. Others described her as determined or wise. She did not see herself as a hero. She believed she had simply refused to give up when everything seemed broken. Over time, she discovered something unexpected. Peace. Not the kind that erased pain, but the kind that allowed her to move forward without fear. She found comfort in daily routines, in conversations with neighbors, and in watching new life grow where fire once destroyed everything. One morning, as she walked across the ranch, she paused to look at the horizon. The land stretched wide and open, filled with possibility. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass, and the sun rose slowly, lighting the valley with gentle warmth. She understood that her journey had changed her forever. The quiet woman who once lived only within the safety of her marriage had become someone stronger, someone capable of facing challenges she never imagined. Yet she still carried kindness. That balance, strength without bitterness, became her greatest victory. As the day began, she turned back toward the ranch house, ready for whatever the future would bring. The past remained part of her story, but it no longer defined her path. The widow had returned not only for justice, but for renewal.